All right, Jerome, say good morning. Let us begin. Let us begin. I'm sorry. All right. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of their parents. Jack Bennett for dedicating the Shiurim this month in memory of First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport. And Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the Shiurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Parrot Moshe ben Avraham David. We also thank our Day of Learning sponsor, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the learning today in memory of Paul's grandfather, Pesach ben Rav Yisachar. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And with that, let us begin. Sorry, good. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Aleph 31, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem by the Mishnah on the top of Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Meviim eitzim min hasada min hamechunos. Shabbos, remember again, now we're talking about over here still muktzah issue. There's two issues. There's a number of issues that are happening over here in these Mishnayos. Of course, there's an ongoing discussion regarding muktzah, which in our sugya appears as muchan. Is something prepared, is something not prepared. Of course, muchan and muktzah are just two sides of the same coin. If something is muchan, it's not muktzah. If it's not muchan, it's muktzah. Then, of course, we constantly also have the ongoing discussion regarding what we'll call uvdin dechol. The idea we saw in yesterday's daf that on Yom Tiv, the more you could be mishana, the more you could change, ultimately, again, the better off it is. So therefore, it says in Mishnah, Mevi'in eitzim min hasada min hamechunos. If you want to get wood on Yom Tiv for fuel, for your fire, so you could go ahead and bring wood from the field as long as it is gathered. Look at Rashi. Now, obviously, we're talking about over here wood that is already detached from the ground, right? Because remember again, halacha lemaisa, one can't detach wood from the ground. That would be the malacha of katsira, of kotzer. So assuming that the wood is already detached from the ground, you can go ahead and get it from the field. Mina mechunas. Rashi says, Im kanso me'erev yamtiv. If you went ahead and you gathered this wood on Erev Yom Tiv, then it's permitted to take it from the field. Why? Degali daite da'alayhu samich ve'ena muktzah aval mufurzarin muktzin. I will say a very simple idea. Wood out in the field is not prepared for use. So therefore, if on Erev Yom Tiv you went and you gathered wood into a pile in the field, then that shows that your intention is to use it on Yom Tiv. Therefore, it's permitted to take it from the field. But if you did not go ahead and pile it or prepare it on Erev Yom Tiv, then by definition, it is muktzah. Umina karfeif. Let's say it's been a while since we've seen a karfeif, right? It's been a while. So what happens if it's from a karfeif? I will say karfeif, as we know from our Gemara Masechah Shabbos days, Masechah Eruvin days, karfeif is any enclosed area that is not necessarily enclosed for residential purposes. So it just means an enclosed area. Mina karfeif, if you have an enclosed area, even if the wood is scattered. Now, what's the logic of the Mishnah? The logic of the Mishnah is that because the karfeif is enclosed, therefore, by definition, it's prepared. Whatever's in there is prepared for use. Therefore, even if the wood is not piled, but the wood simply is there scattered, one could still use that for Yom Tiv because it is considered to be prepared. Look at Rashi. Mina karfeif shumishtamer. A karfeif is guarded. Umukaf saviv, and is enclosed. Therefore, afilu mifuzarin shebo shlo huktzah midaito. Therefore, again, I will say, so because the karfeif is enclosed, anything found inside of the karfeif ultimately is prepared for use. Therefore, I will say, so again, I just want to point out these two, they're not really opposites or extremes, but just two cases. Case number one is eitzim min hasadeh. If you want wood from the field on Yom Tiv, the only way, says the Mishnah, to do that is if the wood was prepared Erev Yom Tiv. What's the definition of preparation? Mechunas. it was piled. If it wasn't piled Erev Yom Tiv, then that wood that's out in the general field is not prepared for use, is muktzah. If it's a karfeif, right, ultimately, again, if it's an area that's enclosed, that's mishtamer, then halacha l'maisa, that wood is prepared, even if it's not bundled, but piled. Sorry. And halacha l'maisa, one would be permitted to go ahead and use that on Yom Tiv. Good. Kol shesamuch li'ir, so the Gemara says, Ezu karfeif. So what's a karfeif? Right? What is a karfeif? So says the Gemara, Kol shesamuch li'ir di Rabbi Yehuda. It's very interesting. So the Gemara is asking over here, what is the general definition of a karfeif? In other words, we'll say, on one hand, we've defined what a karfeif is, in that it's enclosed, but are there any other criteria? So interesting enough, Rabbi Yehuda says, a karfeif is also an area that is samuch le'ir. It is next to the city. So next to habitation. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kol shenichnasin lo beposachos, v'afilu b'soch tchum Shabbos. Rabbi Yossi says like this, the definition of a karfeif is any area that is guarded with a key. That it's enclosed, and you need a key to enter it. Now, what's interesting over here is as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says that in order for an area to be called a karfeif, it has to be samuch le'ir, next to the city. Rabbi Yossi seemingly says it doesn't even have to be so close. As long as it's within the tchum, that's okay. But Rabbi Yossi seems to add in over here is you need a key to get in, which also represents what? A heightened level of shimur, right? That there's an extra level of we'll call it guardedness that is associated with this particular area. Again, we'll see exactly what Rabbi Yossi is saying in the Gemara. Good. Says the Gemara, Am Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Ein mevi'in eitzin ela mina mechunasin shebe karfeif. So it comes along, Rabbi Yehuda says the name is Shmuel, an interesting twist. You see, so remember again, from the Mishnah, what did we have? From the Mishnah, you had two cases. If the wood is in the sadeh, what do you need? Mechunasin, piled. And if it's in the karfeif, what do you need? Nothing. Right? Nothing. You just need it to be a karfeif, whatever the definition of a karfeif is. Interestingly enough, comes on Yehuda in the name of Shmuel and says that you're only allowed to bring wood on Yom Tiv if the wood is gathered in a karfeif. Right? So we'll say, so now Shmuel's this is a different version than the Mishnah. Shmuel's requiring piling, gathering, and karfeif. Says the Gemara, V'ha'anan tinan mina karfeif afila mina mefuzarin. But we learned in our Mishnah that as long as the wood is in a karfeif, it doesn't have to be piled. Even if it's scattered, ultimately, again, that is enough. To which the Gemara says, Masnisin yichidahi. Our Mishnah reflects a singular opinion. Rashi says, Yichidahi, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar ka'amar la, damar beis hillel hachishar. So also we're going to see, interestingly enough, the Mishnah, our Mishnah, does not reflect the normative view. Our Mishnah that halacha l'maisa in a karfeif you don't need it to be piled is not the normative view. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Elazar said, and now Rabbi Shimon Elazar is the das yachid. He is the opinion of the Mishnah. What did he say? Lo nechlaku be'shamai u'be'sila ala mefuzarin shebesados she'in mevi'im. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that scattered wood in a field cannot be utilized on Yom Tiv. So we'll say that out of all the cases, that's the easiest case, right? Why can't you use scattered wood in a field? Why not? It's not muchan, right? That's an easy one. So Rabbi Shimon says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel will both agree that halacha l'maisa scattered wood in a field is unusable. Furthermore, v'ala mechunasin shebekarfeif shemevi'in. What else do they agree on? They agree that piled wood in a karfeif is what? Is usable. So those are the two, we'll call it, those are the two extreme cases. So everyone will agree that scattered wood in the field cannot be used, and piled wood, or I call it piled, but it's gathered wood in a karfeif can be used. So what's the machlokas? Aman nechlaku, ala mifuzarn shebekarfeif. They argue about scattered wood in a karfeif, va'ala mechunasin shebesados, and gathered wood in the fields. I'll say these are the two machlokas cases, right? Scattered wood in a karfeif, and piled wood in the field. Beis Shammai omrim lo yavi. Beis Shammai says you can't go ahead and utilize it. Beis Hillel omrim yavi, and Beis Hillel says you can use it. So therefore, Rabosai, our Mishnah reflects this version of the machlokes in accordance with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. But it's important to note that there is another view of Shmuel, which holds that halacha l'maisa, you certainly can't use scattered wood in the field, but even in a karfev, in order for the wood to be usable, it must be piled, it must be gathered. So this is a machlokes. So again, our Mishnah is reflecting the view of Rabbi Shimon Elazar as he frames the machlokes as we just read, but there is another opinion. We'll see what the halacha l'maisa is in just a bit. Amar Rava. So we'll see. Actually, I'll tell you the halacha l'maisa. No, not yet. So let's first. We'll finish the sugya. Amar Rava. Rava says as follows. We'll say a very interesting gemara. Ali kanim va'ali gifanim. We'll say if you have literally alim, right, are leaves, reed leaves of reeds, va'ali gifanim, or leaves of vines, afagav demekanfiluhu umosiv, even though you gathered them, right, and they're lying on the ground before Yom Tiv. So we'll say, so now let's say you want to utilize these leaves on Yom Tiv. Simple case, you want to use it as fuel for your fire. So what did you do? You listen to the Gemara, so you went ahead and halacha l'maisa gathered everything before Yom Tiv. Listen to this. Kevan di'imad li zeka mevadra lahu kimefuzarin damin va'asurin. We'll say this is incredible. The act of gathering leaves on Erev Yom Tiv does not make them mukhan for use on Yom Tiv itself. Why not? Very simple reason. Why not? Because if the wind blows, what happens? Right? If the wind blows, halacha l'maisa, they scatter. So because if the wind blows, they scatter. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, they're not considered to be mukhan. Therefore, v'i asnach mana me'esmal, if you placed an object on them, right? If you place an object on them, you place something heavy on them on Erev Yom Tiv in order to keep them in place, ultimately shapir dummy, then it is considered to be muchan. So both say, so this is just a follow-up case. Up until now, we've been speaking about gathering of wood. So all you need to do to make wood muchan is to gather it. The Gemara just adding in with leaves, if gathering them in a pile does not make them muchan because the wind could scatter them. You have to put a heavy object on top of them in order to keep them in place, then they are muchan. So, I was thinking about this Gemara, that if you think about it, there is a beautiful profundity in this Gemara as well, which is, if you look at the leaves a little bit as like a metaphor for like sparks of inspiration, right? Because a leaf is a wonderful metaphor for inspiration. Why? Because like we just saw, what happens with leaves? Like they come and go. What happens with moments of inspiration? You gather them, but the truth is, easy come, easy go, right? You go ahead, right? Everyone remembers as a kid, you rake the leaves, you gather them together. You could work for 3 hours to gather leaves. You jump in them for 30 seconds, and then what happens? Everything is dissipated. In the world of inspiration, it works the same way. You could gather your leaves of inspiration, and you could have a beautiful pile, but lamaisa, all it takes is one wind, right? Whatever that wind is, a wind of mundanity, a wind of aveira, a wind of whatever it is, and it scatters everything. So how do you keep your inspiration? What does the Gemara say? You have to put something heavy on top of it. In other words, inspiration has to be anchored in something tangible. If it's not anchored in something tangible, then by definition it dissipates. So for example, I mentioned this many times before. Rav Levi Yitzchak says, he says that whenever a person has a moment of inspiration, he says, just open up a chumash and read a pasuk. Even if it's Vaidabra Shema Moshe Lemar. Because then what happens? A person takes a feeling and they anchor it in something concrete. Now I could say in that moment of inspiration, I learned a pasuk in Chumash. I gave tzedakah. I did an act of chesed. The leaves are beautiful and they're very pretty when they're in a pile, but all it takes is one wind to dissipate everything. And this is such an important yesod, especially coming off Yamim Noraim, because hopefully we have our pile of inspiration, we have our pile of leaves. But if we don't find a way to put something heavy on top of it, to anchor it in concrete behaviors, unfortunately, the leaves are blown all over the place. Incredible Musar skill. Says the Gemara, Ezu karfeif. What is a karfeif? What is a karfeif? So we'll say, so remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit over here. saw machlokes. At least it looks like a machlokes, right? Rabbi Yehuda says a karfeif. Not it looks. It is a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda says a karfeif is an enclosed area that is close to the city. Rabbi Yossi says it could even be within the tchum, but it needs a key to get into it. So says the Gemara, Ibailahu Hechi Kamar. What exactly is the Mishnah saying? Kol shesamoch le'ir v'hu de'islei posachas. So in other words, ultimately, is Rabbi Yehuda saying, as long as the karfeif is close to the city and it has a key, va'asir Rabbi Yossi l'meimar kevan de'islei posachas afilu b'soch tchum Shabbos nami. Shabbos say, so we're trying to figure out what is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. In other words, does everyone agree that in order for an area to be a karfeif, it has to be only accessible with a key? And their machlokes is a proximity machlokes. That Rabbi Yehuda requires it to be close to the city, whereas Rabbi Yossi is okay if what? If it's within the tchum, a little bit further out. But they agree that you need a key. O Dilma, or perhaps, Hachi Kamar, Kol shesamoch le'ir, bein de islei posachas, bein de les posachas, or maybe not. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda says, it doesn't need a key. Whether it has a key or doesn't have a key, that doesn't actually matter. What just matters is proximity. Rabbi saying, again, I want to be clear. A karfeif by definition is always what? Always what? Always enclosed. Right? So that's not even a discussion over here. It's not a karfeif if it's not enclosed. So we're trying to just figure out what the machlokes is. So possibility one is everyone agrees you need a key, right? There has to, which means there's an extra level of shmira, right? There's an extra level of guarded kite that's associated with this karfeif. The machlokes is in proximity. Rabbi Yehuda says it needs to be close to the city. Rabbi Yossi says even within the tchum. Or the second possibility is no. Rabbi Yehuda holds as long as this proximity, as long as it's samoch le'ir, has a key, doesn't have a key, it doesn't really matter that much. Va'asir Rabbi Yossi l'meimar afilu b'soch tchum Shabbos v'dafka de'islei posachas. Avalas le posachas afilu samach le'ir namilo. And comes along Rabbi Yossi and says, no, the key is very important. If you have the key, right, if it's guarded and it has a key, even if it's a little bit further out, as long as it's within tchum, it's okay. But if you don't have a key, even if it's samach le'ir, at the end of the day, that's not called a karfeif. So we'll say, so we're just trying to frame the machlokes. So Tashma, midiktani Rabbi Yossi, midiktani, since it says Rabbi Yossi Omer, kol shenichnasin lo beposachas, afilu besoch tchum Shabbos, shma mina, Rabbi Yossi tarti lekula kamar shma mina. But I see, the Gemara says, since the Mishnah reads that Rabbi Yossi says, anything that you could enter in with a key, even if it's within the tchum, Rabbi Yossi is being makel on two accounts. The Gemara says this seems to be start from Mishnah. Rabbi says, so what does this mean? If you take a look at Rashi, second wide line of Rashi, Tarti lekula kamar, kilomar, mid Rabbi Yossi nishma Rabbi Huda delav tarvayhu boy. Rabbi Yossi betartim akio. Rabbi Yossi is makel on both things. Number one, the machshir besamoch below posachas, or beposachas below samoch. So we'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Yossi says that halacha l'maisa, you could be makel in one of two ways. Either it could be samoch, right? If the karfeif is nearby, you don't need a key. Or if the karfeif could even be further away, but does have a key. So what Rabbi Yossi essentially says is really all you need is one or the other. Either you need proximity or you need the key, but you don't need both. Now, I will say, when we say that Rabbi Yossi holds that you don't need proximity, remember, there's still a ceiling on that, right? What's the ceiling on that? What's the ceiling? Is the tchum. But the point where it says the Gemara is Rabbi Yossi saying either if it's samoch, you don't need a posachas, you don't need a key, or if it's further away, ultimately, again, it can be further within the tchum, but it requires a key. Incredible Shmamina. Amr of Salam Rabbi Yehuda, halacha Rabbi Yossi lahakel. Rabbi Salah sending Rabbi Yirmiyah that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi to be makel. Namely, again, I both say that either it can be samoch with a key, or rachok, or what we'll call in the tchum without a key. That's the halacha. So we'll say, so just a little bit of halacha l'maisa to close out this sugya. So the Shulchan Aruch here, this is in Siman Tov Kuf Aleph, and this is Seifim Gimel and Daled. So listen to this. Here's the halacha l'maisa. Ein mevin eitzim min hasoda, afilu im hayu mechunasim sham mi ba'erev. Shabbos says, so first of all, interestingly enough, we paskin like Shmuel, not like the version in the Mishnah. We paskin like Shmuel, and therefore you cannot bring wood from the field on Yom Tiv, even if what? Even if it was gathered on Erev Yom Tiv. Right? Wood in the field is considered to be simply not muchan. I said the Shulchan Aruch gives an example to this. He said, or an exception of Magavid hu b'sadeh mishalafonov. So umaliki sham. He says what you can do is, if you prepared wood in the field Erev Yom Tiv, you could light a fire in the field. In other words, so if you went ahead and you piled it in the field, you could light it in the field. But you can't bring it back to your house. Okay. But you can't. So both sides. Therefore, again, on item number one, we paskin like Shmuel, namely that halacha l'maisa, we do not bring wood from the field, even if it was piled erev Yom Tiv. Good. What about the karfeif issues? Listen to this. Listen to this. But if you prepared wood, what we call a karfeif, if you prepared wood in a karfeif, then halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and utilize that wood on Yom Tiv. Listen to this. Here we go. O bilvad shie ba misgeres, as long as what? It has a lock and a key. V'tiyeh b'soch tchum Shabbos, and it's within the tchum. So we'll say it needs to have a key and it needs to have a tchum, and it needs to be within the tchum. V'im chaser achas mikol elu harei elu muktzah. And if you're missing any of these two criteria, then halacha l'maisa, the wood cannot be used. Therefore, we'll say halacha l'maisa, preparing wood on Erev Yom Tiv in the field does nothing for you unless you want to use it in the field. You cannot use that in your home. And prepared wood in a karfeif works as long as it is within the tchum and it has a lock and key. Good. So the Shulchan Aruch also paskins about the leaf case that we mentioned. Ali kanim v'ali gifanim afa pi shem mechunasim bekarfeif kevan sharuach mefazeres osam harem kimefuzarin va'asurim v'imhiniach aleim kli kaved mi erev yom tiv arim mechram. So there are Shulchan Aruch also paskins in the case of the leaves, piling leaves on erev yom tiv does not make them muchan, because why? The wind could scatter them. They're only considered muchan if what? If you put something heavy on top of them. Beautiful. We'll say, let's go weiter. Says the Mishnah. Ein mevakin eitzilom minakors. We'll say, this is actually a great case. You cannot go ahead and chop wood from koros, from beams. V'lo minakorish nishbra b'yom tiv. Now, both say, now, the pashut idea of this, we'll see, is that when the Gemara talks about koros refers to beams that are set aside for construction. So if you have beams that are set aside for construction and you decide to go ahead and use them for firewood on Yom Tiv, that doesn't work, because since they're set aside for construction, they're muktzah. So you can't chop wood from koros. V'lo min hakorash nishbra b'yom tiv. Let's say you had a beam, right? Now again, bepashtos, when we talk about koros, they're set aside for construction. What happens if you had a beam that broke on Yom Tiv? You still can't use it for firewood. Why not? Was it muchan? Right? It wasn't muchan from Erev Yom Tiv. V'lo min hakor shesh Yom Tiv. Ve'ein revakin lo bekardum v'lo b'mageira v'lo b'magol. Furthermore, again, you can't chop wood with an axe, nor can you do it with a saw, nor can you do it with a sickle. Ella bekofitz. Shabbos said kofitz is like a meat cleaver. It's a knife. So what's the problem? Look at Rashi. Why can't you use these utensils, right? Why can't I use the kardum, the mager, and the magol, the axe, the saw, and the sickle to go ahead and chop wood? Rashi says, "Stam kardum asoi kemin kli umnus she'osin ba'uchbos v'sargos v'yesha asoi kein kliya uman shekorn sharasha katar dom the kardumos roshin." So listen to this. So the issue over here is that halacha l'maisa, it's what's called a kli uman. These are called the utensils of a craftsman. So because they are utensils of a craftsman, it looks like one is engaging in specialized malacha on Yom Tiv. So because of that, one is not permitted to go ahead and utilize these utensils. So we'll say, so there are two halachas over here. Halacha number one is what you could take firewood from on Yom Tiv, right? You're allowed to burn a fire, so you're allowed to kindle a fire, so you're allowed to take firewood. what are you allowed to take firewood from? So on a very simple level, if something was set aside for non-use at the onset of Yom Tiv, you can't use it for firewood on Yom Tiv. But even something which you're permitted to use for firewood on Yom Tiv, there are limitations as to what type of kli you can use to chop up the wood. It cannot be what's called a kli uman, a craftsman kli. Therefore, essentially, if you want to chop up wood on Yom Tiv, no problem, you could do it, but you use a knife. You just use a knife. Good. Says the Gemara, Amud Beis. Amud Beis. Vaha Amrit Reisha, Ein Mevakin Klal. So I will say, here's the problem. The Mishnah doesn't really read well, right? Because the way I was explaining the Mishnah according to the Gemara, but when you go ahead and you read the Mishnah, the first thing the Mishnah says is what? We don't chop wood. We don't chop wood. And then the Mishnah says, by the way, but you could chop wood with a cleaver, right? So the Gemara says, why does the end of the Mishnah teach me what kind of utensils I am permitted to use for chopping wood, when the beginning of the Mishnah says you don't chop wood at all? In reality, the Mishnah is missing a piece. And here's how you have to read it. Ein mevakin min hasoar shel koros v'lo min hakorosh nishbra b'yom tiv. This is a very interesting case. You cannot go ahead and chop wood from soar shel koros. We'll say soar literally means a stack. If you look at Rashi, soar shel koros hamushkavos la'aretz shel binyan. So we'll say, so again, this is, if you see this, right? You see this by construction all the time, right? You just see a stack of wood by a construction site. So that wood obviously is set aside for construction. So therefore, you cannot go ahead and chop up wood from a soar shel koros below minakora shenishbara b'yom tiv. Nor can you go ahead and chop up wood for fuel on a fire from a beam which broke on Yom Tiv. Look at Rashi again. Korosh nishbara b'yom tiv. V'avagav dahashtala saka kaimo. Remember, we keep going through this. We keep going back to these same core concepts. Hilchos muktzah, right? Perhaps the most important halacha by Hilchos muktzah is what? We determine status as of when? As of when? Ben hashmashas. So therefore, again, if you had a construction beam at the onset, or a beam that was going to be used for construction at the onset of Yom Tiv, even though now it breaks, therefore it's no longer fit for construction. It's really only fit for one thing, which is what? Fuel for a fire. You cannot use it on Yom Tiv. Aval, so we'll say, so therefore again, halacha number one is if you have wood that is actively set aside for non-use. So we'll say now, what I also want to point out is something very interesting. Remember, how are these items set aside for non-use? How are they set aside? It's not like anyone is making an active designation. It's a circumstantial designation. In other words, that when you see a pile of wood, that's clearly construction wood, right? So halacha l'maisa, by definition, just categorically, those items are set aside for non-use. And then, so therefore, so case number one is the actual construction wood. Can't use it for fuel as a fire. Case number two, even if a piece of that construction wood breaks on a Yom Tiv, you still can't use it for hasak. You still can't use it for Yom Tiv because it was set aside for non-use at Ben hashmashas. Aval, so we'll say, so that's case one. What's the aval? Aval, mevakin min hakorash nishbara me erev Yom Tiv. But if you have a beam that broke on erev Yom Tiv, we'll say, what's the status of a beam that broke on erev Yom Tiv? What's the status? Usable. Why? Because it was designated. I will say, now, again, let's just, did I designate it? No. Once again, when we come to, remember again, we'll say, this is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon by muktzah. In order for something not to be muktzah, I don't have to actively designate it for use. It just has to be circumstantially designated for use. So by definition, a broken beam is circumstantially designated for use. Because what else? It's no longer usable for construction. So by definition, it's usable for asaka, for flame. I don't have to say hineni muchel mazuman to use this beam to fuel my fire. Circumstantially, it is set aside for use. This is case number two. But you can go ahead and take a beam from a beam that broke on erev Yom Tiv. So we'll say that's halacha number 2. So halacha number 1 is if the wood was set aside for construction as of Erev Yom Tov, as of Bein HaShmashas, even if something changed, you cannot use it on Yom Tov. Case 2, if the beam broke on Erev Yom Tov, it can be used for fuel on Yom Tov. Now, in case number 2, there is still a qualification. In case number 2, suppose I say, I have a beam that broke on Erev Yom Tov, I now want to use it for fuel on Yom Tov. Totally mutter. Now the Gemara, the Mishnah says, what can you break that beam with? What can you chop up that beam with? When you go and you chop up that beam which broke on Erev Yom Tov, which is now fit for use on Yom Tov itself, ein mevakin lo bekardum velo b'magol velo b'magera ela bekofitz. So now once I'm permitted to go ahead and utilize the beam, the Mishnah says, by the way, you can't just break up that beam with anything. You have to, in other words, you can't use what's called a kli uman, a craftsman's tool, but rather you have to use essentially a knife, right? A big knife, a cleaver, right? You have to use a knife in order to break up, because we'll say that's the shinui with which you have to break up. So again, part 1 of the discussion is what kind of wood you could use. Part 2 of the discussion is even in the world of permitted wood, you could only go ahead and break it up with a non-kli uman, a non-craftsman tool. That supports this. Ein mevakin eitzim lo min asar. You cannot go ahead and halacha lemaisa, go ahead and break up or utilize on Yom Tov wood that was construction wood, that was from a pile of wood, or that was set aside for construction because it is not min hamuchan. Good, so now we've successfully explained that first sugya. Category 1, wood set aside for construction, can't use it on Yom Tov even if it breaks on Yom Tov. Category 2, wood that broke on Erev Yom Tov, fit for use for fuel as a fire on Yom Tov, but even when you're chopping up that wood, can't chop it up with a craftsman tool, kli uman, can only chop it up with a knife. Beautiful. V'lo bakardum. So we'll say, so now watch this. Amar Rav Chinana bar Shalmia, mishmei dirav, lo shanu ella b'nakvus shala, aval bezichrus shala mutter. So we'll say, this is very interesting. So you can't use a kardum, you can't use an axe. So the Gemara says, when can't you use an axe? You can't use an axe, but the Gemara says what's called the nakvus, which literally means it's a feminine side. Only the masculine side. What does that mean? So Rashi says over here, apparently the feminine side is called the thicker blade. The masculine side is called the thinner blade. So interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Rav Chinna bar Shalmia says, you can't use the thicker blade of the axe. You could only use the thinner blade of the axe. So we'll say, just apparently in the world of wood chopping, the thicker blade would be the blade you would normally use for chopping wood. The thinner one is not. So what the Gemara is saying over here is, when we say you can't use the axe, what it means is you can't use the axe in the normal way, right? You can't use the axe with the thicker blade, but you could use an axe with a thinner blade. So the Gemara says, Pshita, b'kofitz. The Gemara says, of course, that's why it says kofitz. We'll say when the Mishnah says you could use a knife, what's the chap with a knife? What's the chap with a knife? It's a thin blade. I'm sorry, it's a thicker blade, excuse me. I'm sorry, it's a thinner blade, right? So that's what it means when it says you can use the knife, but we'll say it's not just the utensil, it's also the type of blade. In other words, people wouldn't normally, which logically you don't normally cut apart wood with a thin knife blade. That's a shinui. So of course that's what it means when it says you can use the cleaver. To which the rest of the tema, Hani mili kofetz l'chudei aval kardem v'kofetz. So we'll say, listen to this. What the Gemara says is, I understand when the Mishnah says you can only use a knife or a cleaver, that means a thinner blade. But we'll say, what happens if you have a tool that has both a thick blade on one side and a thinner blade on another side? Right? So we'll say, let's say you have both. So you might have thought, Mao detema, Hani mili kofetz l'chudei. Aval kardum v'kofitz, what happens if you have a utensil that has the kardum, right, that has the thicker blade on one side, and the kofitz, the thinner blade on the other? You might have thought, Meima, miga da haigisa aser, haigisa nami aser. I would have thought that perhaps since one side, i.e. the thicker side, is aser for use, so to the thinner side should be aser for use. In other words, we'll say, maybe once a utensil has the prohibited type of blade, then what? the entire utensil becomes aser for use. So the Gemara says, Kamashma, that's not the case. Kamashma, when the Mishnah says you could use a knife or you could use the cleaver, what it means is you could use a thin blade, and even if you have a utensil with a double blade, right? One a thicker one, one a thinner one, you can't use the thicker one, but you can use the thinner one. Others go ahead and put this conversation on the seifa. Ella b'kofitz, the Mishnah says the only thing you use is a kofitz, is a knife, is a cleaver. Amar Rav Chinina bar Shalmia mishmei derav lo shon ella b'zichros shalah. You're only allowed to use the masculine blade, the thin blade. Aval benakvus shalah aser. But the thin blade you're not allowed to use. The thick blade you're not allowed to use. So Pshita, the Gemara says that's obvious. V'lo b'kardum tanan, it says you can't use an axe, which means you cannot use the thick blade. Ma'odetei, what would you have thought? Hani mili kardum. Maybe it's only an axe that you can't use. Aval kofitz the kardum, but maybe if you have, we'll say the same thing, maybe you have a utensil that has a thick blade and a thinner blade. Migo da haigisa shari, haigisa namashari. I would have thought that halacha lamaisa, maybe since one side is permitted, once the thinner side is permitted, that permits the kli in its entirety, and maybe you could even use the thicker side. Kamashmalan no. So therefore, we'll say what comes out of this sugya are three halachas, right? Halacha number one is any wood that was set aside for construction at the onset of Yom Tiv cannot be used on Yom Tiv, even if it breaks over the course of Yom Tiv. Halacha number two, any wood which breaks on Erev Yom Tiv is fit for use on Yom Tiv itself. And halacha number three, when chopping up that permitted wood for use on Yom Tiv, one must do so in a different way, with the shinui. And how do we do the shinui? You use a different kind of kli. You don't use a kli uman, you don't use a craftsman's kli, instead you just use effectively a knife. And how do we define a knife? According to the Gemara, any utensil with a thinner blade. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah. We'll say this is actually a fascinating. There's a lot of interesting halacha in this sugya also, but all right, we'll leave this for now. So I'll say, so pretty much, I just want to point out, pretty much the halacha l'maisa is exactly what I just told you. Those three pieces of information, those 3 points all appear in Siman Taf Kuf Aleph Sif Aleph. If we have time, I'll go back. Yeah, it's Sif Aleph. It's good. Yeah, it's pretty much the same exact halacha. Good. Says the Mishnah. Both say very interesting. Bayis Shumali Peiros. Listen to this. You have a home that is filled with fruit. I will say the easier way to imagine this for a moment is not, it doesn't have to be a home, right? Imagine you have a room. You have a room that is filled with peiros, or it could be a storehouse, right? A silos, or something that's filled with fruit. And what happens? So I'll say now there's an important piece over here. The entranceway, the doorway, was closed up. Now we'll see exactly how it was closed up and what it was closed up with. But the idea is, as of the start of Yom Tiv, this storage room with fruit was closed up. So the Gemara says, and not just with the door, was we'll see sealed up in a more significant way. V'nifchas, and then over the course of Yom Tiv, there's a breach. So suddenly again, the fruit is accessible. And Rashi points out, v'nifchas me'elov. So there's a breach. So whatever part of the enclosure breaks. So now what happens? So the Mishnah says, no tell me macham pasach. Ultimately, you're allowed to take fruit from the breach. In other words, you can reach in and take fruit. Rashi says over here, no tell me macham hapachas. V'lo aminan muktzin machmas iserhein de'em yachal pascha b'yantiv v'asach daita minayhu. So I will say we're going to see over here. I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to ruin the surprise because Rashi gives us the whole sugya. But here's what's fascinating about this. You both say, why is this interesting? You would have not thought this is the halacha. You would have thought that if the entranceway to the fruit storage, to the fruit storeroom, is sealed on Yom Tiv, Erev Yom Tiv, what does that mean? What's the status of the fruit? Muktzah. What's right to think about it? Ein muktzah gedola mizo. If that entranceway, if that doorway is sealed up, it's not talking about where there's a door. We're going to see it means that there's a more significant barrier there. There's a significant barrier there. What does that indicate? What does that indicate? Non-usage, right? That's it. It's off. Yet, interestingly enough, we're seeing that if there's a breach that develops, you didn't do it, but there's a breach that develops, you can go to access the fruit. Why that is, we'll see. I'm not going to spoil it with Rashi. Rashi, this is a spoiler alert with Rashi over here. Mamish, he ruins the whole sugya. So listen to this. So Rabbi Meir says, Av poches lechatchila v'notel. Now, both say Rabbi Meir even goes a step further. Rabbi Meir says, You could even open up. You could even create the breach yourself lechatchila on Yom Tiv. So I will say, what is going on over here? Says the Gemara, va'amai, v'hakasasar Allah. So we'll say, so even before we get into the first part of the sugya, the truth is, it turns out that the most dramatic part of this sugya is the position of Rabbi Meir, right? How does Rabbi Meir allow me to go ahead and create a breach in the wall? L'chatchila. After all, again, isn't that stira? Isn't that an act of demolition? To which the Gemara says, no, what's the case? Amar Rav Nechumi bar Adam Shmuel ba'avir delivni. Oh, so we'll say, here's the case. Avir delivni, Rashi says over here, avir delivni, sidur shalavanim belotit. So what you have over here is you have bricks or stones, for that matter, piled one on top of the other, with no mortar. So now the image becomes a little bit clearer. So imagine you have a storeroom for fruit. You put all the fruit in there, and you pile bricks. But there is no cement. There's no mortar holding the bricks in place. So apparently, what Rabbi Meir is saying is like this: because there's no mortar holding them in place. Therefore, what? This is not called a binyan. This is not called a structure. If it's not called a structure, then what? Then the removal of a brick is not what? Is not stira. It's not stira. Incredible. So the Gemara says, really? So the Gemara says, says this so that the arrangements of bricks, one on top of the other, without mortar, without cement, is not called a structure, and therefore the removal of those bricks would not go ahead and result in steer. Now, even before we go on, what I want to point out is this is very important, even besides Rabbi Meir, because remember again, now I understand the first part of the Mishnah. What was the first part of the Mishnah? First part of the Mishnah was, I have a storeroom with fruit. Then there's a wall blocking off that storeroom. So what did the Mishnah say? The first opinion of the Mishnah, what did it say? That if there's a breach in the wall on Yom Tov, I could take fruit. Now I understand. What's the wall? The wall is a wall of bricks without mortar. So I will say, so now go back to Rashi in the Mishnah for just a moment before we go on. Look at Rashi, where Rashi says, no tomi makom apachas. Rashi says, v'lo aminal muktzah machmas israhein, den yochel apaskel v'yantav, asad dait yuminayo, dechivan de lo hava psichaso isr d'oraisa. See, I will say, the removal of this wall, or creating a breach in this wall, is not an isr d'oraisa. Why is it not an isr d'oraisa? Right? The isr d'oraisa would be what? What would be what? Stira. It's not stira. Why? Because the bricks are just piled one on top of the other without being cemented in place. Now that it's not an Isser D'Oraisa, Kidemukminala ba'avira delivni, lav muktzaninhu, Kidamar gabe teval b'shili perek shumucha. Supposed to listen to this. So because this is not a real wall, legabe hilchos Shabbos, or legabe hilchos Yom Tiv, therefore by definition, the produce is not really set aside for non-use. In other words, this produce is accessible with an Isra D'Rabbanan, or for that matter, again, also because it's not a real wall, it's quite possible that what? That a brick will fall off. And if a brick will fall off, then what? The fruit suddenly becomes accessible. Therefore, Allah Lamaisa, it's not really muktzah. It's not really muktzah. Now, Rabbi Meir goes a step further, and Rabbi Meir says, you can even breach the wall. Right? You could even remove some of the bricks to access. Right? Tanakama is saying you can't breach it, but if it was breached, if it happened by itself, you could access the fruit. Rabbi Meir says literally you could take it yourself. Okay, so back to the Gemara. Ini, is that so? Vam Rav Nachman, Hani livni, di yaisar mibinyana, shari l'taltulinhu b'shabsa, hoil v'chazil mizgalayu. But yet, we learned as follows. Rav Nachman said, if you have leftover bricks for construction, or leftover stones from construction, you can go ahead and move them on Shabbos. Why? Because they can be used to recline on. In other words, once I see, we'll say now the idea over here is, just to be clear what's happening, is these are stones that are at a construction site, or bricks at a construction site, that are extra, right? So they're not going to be used. Once they're not going to be used for construction, I can go ahead and move them on Shabbos. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, they can be used to recline upon. The Gemara says, Sharginhu, But once you arrange the bricks or the stones in a row, in other words, once you pile them on top of each other, vadai aktsinu, they have certainly been set aside for non-use, right? Rashi says, sharginu, sidrin ze'al azu alzu, galei daite shemaktzan lebinyan, vasal tatlinu. So we'll say, once you pile stuff on top of each other, that's a binyan, right? That's bona, that's a structure. They're certainly set aside for non-use. So we'll say, so what's going on over here, right? So you tell me now the Mishnah is a case of where you're creating a barrier to the fruit storage room with a pile of bricks, but they're just piled on top of each other. They're not cemented. And therefore, Rabbi Meir says you could even actively take it apart because it's not called a binyan. We see that piling bricks on top of each other is called binyan, is called building. To which the Gemara says it's not a kasha. Amar Rabbi Zera, b'yamtiv amru avalo b'Shabbos. Oh, so we'll say very interesting. There apparently is a distinction between Yom Tiv and Shabbos. When Rabbi Meir allows you to deconstruct a wall of bricks which are just on top of each other but not cemented, that's on Yom Tiv. That's on Yom Tiv. But on Shabbos, he would not permit this. Look at Rashi. Rabbi Zera b'Yom Tiv, Hiti Rabbi Meir, Kevin de Midrabanan hu da'aser, umishum simchas Yom Tiv shari. Shari muter ba'ochal nefesh. Avalo b'Shabbos, b'shon tefillah. So let's listen to this. When does Rabbi Meir allow you to deconstruct a wall of bricks when the bricks have been laid out one on top of the other without cement? Yom Tiv. And I will say, by the way, does Rabbi Meir just stam allow you to deconstruct a wall of bricks, of uncemented bricks for no reason? No, only when there's a Simchas Yom Tiv Ochal Nefesh purpose. But for Shabbos, he would not allow you to do that. Quite interesting. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry? Yeah, Ochal Nefesh, correct. So that's what Rashi is saying. Rabbi Meir allows you to do this, A, because it's Yom Tiv, and B, they're really the same thing, and B, because there's a Simchas Yom Tiv Ochal Nefesh piece. Says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, both say it's another interesting case. Chosama shebekarka, both will at least begin this again today. Chosama shebekarka, both say, look at Rashi, it's an interesting case. Chosama shebekarka, kigon, daltos pische boros umaara, hasigurim bekesha chavalim. So we'll say, here's the case. Imagine for a moment you have a pit, and the pit has a cover, right? But the cover is more like a doorway, right? So you open and close it. Now remember again, what you would do with that pit is how you wouldn't just leave the doorway alone. You would tie the doorway down to the ground, right? You'd have a little latch or whatever, something. You'd anchor the doorway down to the ground. That's called chosamos shebekarka. So we'll say chosamos are the locks, right? So it's the lock on that pit cover. So what's the halacha? Matir, you could untie that on Shabbos Yom Tov, avalo mafkia, but you cannot unravel the rope, v'lo chotech, nor can you cut the rope either on Shabbos / Yom Tov. Now what's happening over here? Look at Rashi. Matir, esa kesher, so you could untie the knot. Why? Because Rashi says, remember again, there is one of the 39 malachos is kosher, is tying a knot, and therefore the corollary to that is matir, is untying a knot. That malacha only applies to a kesher shel kayama, a knot which is intended to endure. But because this knot, which covers the pit cover, which holds the pit cover in place, is made to be tied and untied, untying it or tying it is not a problem on Shabbos. However, avalo mafkia, you cannot unravel the rope, velo chotech, and you cannot go ahead and cut it. Then I was saying, interesting enough, why can't you cut or unravel the rope? This is fascinating. That would be called stira. That would be called demolition. Why, Rabbi Hossein? Because remember again, where is this covered anchored, right? Where is this rope anchored to? The ground. Anything that is attached to the ground has halachically the status of a structure. Therefore, if you were to unravel this rope, that would be or to cut the rope, that would be an act of demolition. Incredible. However, shebekelim, but we'll say, let's say you have a kli, and the kli has a cover, and the cover is fastened with a rope. So matir umafkia v'chotech echad Shabbos v'echad Yom Tov. So I will say, but however, again, if you have a cover on a kli and that cover is fastened with a rope, you could untie that rope, you could unravel that rope, and you could even cut that rope both on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Why Rabbi say? Because how is the Gemara paskening? This goes back to our smichas chaver discussions. How is the Gemara paskening? Ein binyan b'kelim. There is melacha of bona. Does not apply to utensils. It only applies to structures which are anchored to the ground. All right, well, so you know what? We'll stop over here. We'll Yahrzeit Hashem pick up at the Meisvei in Yahrzeit Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. Yeah, go right ahead. Please.
Anyone that can make a Shiva Minyan at Lebanon at 7111 Park Heights Avenue, number 612. That's Park Towers East, 7111, number 612, 55.
Good to see you.